Hello, welcome to our latest live webinar from Alcatel-Lucent Enterprise Network Solutions. Today, this is a dedicated session to network security and specifically the 5 steps for micro-segmentation. My name is Deanne Corcoran and I work on the Network Business Enablement team, and I'm your webinar host for today. A couple housekeeping items before we get started. Of course, the call today is being recorded. If you have any objections, you can certainly disconnect now. All lines are muted during the presentation. After the presentation, we take questions from the attendees. You may post a written question or comment at any time during the webinar via the questions tab in the webinar control panel, and those questions will be addressed first during the Q&A period at the end. The presentation is being shared live for those of you who have connected online. You can also download a copy of the presentation from the handout section, and very shortly I'm going to upload a white paper to the handout section on the security best practices that has been recently updated. So I just want people to watch for that, and I will remind you again at the end of the call that it will be there. Again, the topic for today's call is the 5 steps of micro-segmentation. Our speaker today is Patricio Marcelo, who's the Director of Solution Architecture here at Alcatel-Lucent Enterprise. And without further ado, Patricio, go ahead and start.
Thanks for the introduction. Hello and welcome to this webinar on the 5 phases of a network micro-segmentation strategy. My name is Patricio Marcelo and I'm a solutions architect with Alcatel-Lucent Enterprise. Micro-segmentation is one of the first milestones in the Zero Trust journey. It creates a software-defined security microperimeter in which every network access is authenticated and every communication flow is authorized. However, retrofitting a legacy network with micro-segmentation requires careful planning and execution to avoid disruption. In this webinar, I will present a practical zero-nonsense approach to micro-segmenting the LAN without creating chaos in the process. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. I could have included those typical statistics about the number of enterprises that have fallen victims of cyber attacks, the cost of cybercrime, or a timeline showing the acceleration of cyber attacks over the years. But I think this comic summarizes the situation very well. Unfortunately, it's not just home appliances that will refuse to work unless we pay the ransom. When a hospital is victim of a cyber attack and has to go offline in the middle of a pandemic, lives are at risk and it's not funny. Zero Trust requires authentication and authorization of every user and device before access to data is allowed. And micro-segmentation is one of the approaches to Zero Trust. In a nutshell, what micro-segmentation does is reduce the blast radius. And so, if the coffee maker is somehow compromised, the threat does not spread from the coffee maker to the toaster or to the microwave oven. Here's the agenda. I'll start with an introduction to the Zero Trust framework. I'll explain the concept of micro-segmentation and its cousin, macro-segmentation. What are the differences between these two? Which one do we use, or do we use both? And then I'll go through the different phases in the transformation from a legacy network design to a micro-segmentation design. And yes, it's done in phases. It's highly unlikely that we will be able to transform a brownfield scenario into a micro-segmented design in one go because there's a lot to cover. I'll explain some tools and tips that will help in these different phases. The overall methodology will be vendor agnostic. When we get to discuss specific tools and tips, I will focus on ALE products, but the same process and steps would be applicable no matter what vendor we're talking about. But of course, your mileage may vary. Lastly, I will close with key takeaways and we will have a live Q&A. So let's begin. Let's start by explaining the concept of Zero Trust framework using micro-segmentation by contrasting the old approach to network security and the new one. The analogy for the old model is a fortress. We build a fortress around the enterprise. The fortress represents the firewall, and anything coming from the outside is untrusted and scrutinized, but anything from the inside is implicitly trusted and allowed. This trust boundary is both physical, what side of the wall you're in, and implicit because as long as you're on the right side of the wall, no further checks are made. In this approach, We may have some basic segmentation in the form of VLANs, SSIDs, subnets, or interfaces tied to a firewall. But this segmentation is static and has more to do with network scalability and manageability than with security. This approach is obsolete for various reasons. The first reason is mobility. Users connect to other networks outside the enterprise and can bring threats with them. Guests are not necessarily trustworthy. Not even employees are to be blindly trusted. IoT devices have a higher risk because they may not be sanctioned and managed by IT. Their security capabilities are weak. But with this approach, if user or device is compromised, there's little to nothing stopping the threat from spilling over to other users and devices. Once you're inside, you're free to move. Going back to the fortress analogy, if the only thing protecting the enterprise from the zombies outside is a wall, the day the zombies learn how to climb the wall, and they will, it will be carnage. Let's contrast this with a zero trust approach using micro-segmentation. In zero trust, users and devices are not trusted whether they're on-premise or off-premise. They go through the same checks. There's no such thing as trusting internal users. Every access is authenticated. If we talk about segmentation, the analogy would be that on top of the fortress that protects from outside threats, every house, every building has its own security to protect from other risks coming from the inside, such as criminals who live inside the fortress. But microsegmentation, software-defined microsegmentation specifically, takes it another step further. On top of the fortress and the security around the building, we also have personal security guards that follow us around wherever we go. And wherever we go, we will be asked for a passport. This trust boundary is fuzzy, is distributed, and is mobile. It's not tied to a particular location, switch port, or VLAN. It depends on the identity, the device, the situation, the time of the day, etc. It's software defined and it's adjusted on the fly. The key necessity to this approach is that the components are managed and should be able to react and reconfigure as needed to respond to threats or change in the workflow. In the Zero Trust framework, the enterprise is not considered an implicit trust zone. The guiding principle is acting as if the attackers were already present. This involves actions such as authenticating all connections. No asset and no user is inherently trusted. A good analogy is migrations at the airport. In a zero trust model, all checks are made regardless of where the passenger is coming from the air side or from the land side. There is no presumption that the risk is always coming from the outside. A criminal may be trying to flee the country to escape a conviction, for example, or someone may have overstayed their visa, etc. It's scary that border security does not work like this in all countries. All checks depend on the first and most fundamental check, which is the identity. If we cannot prove that the passport is authentic and belongs to us, then other checks are irrelevant. So it should come as no surprise that authentication is one of the pillars of the zero trust model. And when referring to microsegmentation, what we are talking about is NAC, Network Access Control, using strong authentication such as 802.1x. There's two kinds of segmentation, macro and micro segmentation. Let's illustrate with an example. In macro segmentation, the physical network is partitioned in different logical segments. These segments can be a VLAN, a combination of VLAN plus a VRF. It could also be a VPN when talking about shortest path bridging, MPLS, or even VXLAN or GRE tunnels. Any traffic between users or devices on different segments is controlled by a physical firewall. All enterprises use segmentation in some way, shape, or form, but not always for security reasons. Quite often, this kind of segmentation is used for scalability, administrative, or organizational reasons. If two devices are mapped to different VLANs, but they can communicate without going through a firewall, then they are on the same macro segment from a security standpoint. Typical example of this kind of segmentation is running IP telephony on separate VLANs and VRF, which are logically isolated from PCs. The next question is how to map users or devices to these segments. This can be done statically by switch port or SSID, for example, but that's an obsolete way of doing things. It's too rigid and does not bode well with mobile users. On Omni Switch and Omni Access Stellar Wi-Fi, this segmentation is done dynamically. It's software defined. When the user or device connects and authenticates, it is assigned a profile, and this profile will provision the user or device on the right segment regardless of the physical location, switch port or SSID. Up to this point, we are still talking about macro segmentation, which does have security benefits, but in many cases is done for organizational or administrative reasons. For instance, cameras and door locks fall under the control of the access security group, whereas thermostats fall under the control of the building maintenance group. Microsegmentation takes things one step further. Not all users are the same, and not all users have a legitimate need to access all resources. The same profile which maps users to a segment also includes a set of policies which add fine-grained control over user device privileges, which are different for different roles, such as HR or finance. This is known as role-based access, and this is directly related to the principle of least privilege. And so, even though cameras and door locks are both on the same segment, they do not need to use the same resources. The camera needs to communicate with the video recorder and the door lock with its server. There is no need for a camera to communicate with the door lock or for two door locks to communicate with one another. These fine-grained permissions are implemented through policies which are part of the profile and are dynamically applied to the device after authentication. To summarize these two kinds of segmentation, communication between different segments is controlled by a physical firewall. This is macro segmentation. But communication within the same segment is controlled by NAC policies associated to the device or user role. This is micro-segmentation. One question that comes up is, do we really need both? Let's see what happens when you only use one of them. Let's start with macro-segmentation. The problem with this approach is that the firewall becomes a bottleneck. All VLANs have to be terminated at the firewall and we have performance issues. Or we start deploying more firewalls at the distribution layer. This is quite costly and still not so good from performance point of view because firewalls are not wire rate. Lastly, there's now multiple policy enforcement points, multiple places to keep policies up to date. We need a tool to coordinate all that. Even with such a tool, if those policies are based on subnets and IP addresses rather than identity, it will be extremely cumbersome to manage. The other option is also problematic. If the only policy enforcement is done through NAC policies, then this policy list will become very long and complex, and we may exhaust the device capacity limits. Bottom line, it's better to have a balance between these two forms of segmentation. Let the firewall control any traffic between different segments, vertical segmentation, and let NAC policies control traffic within a given segment, horizontal or lateral segmentation. By combining these two, we not only act on security threats that spill over from one security segment to another, but also the ones that move laterally across the same segment. To give a more tangible example, microsegmentation is what stops an attacker who has managed to compromise a camera from using it as a pivot to compromise other resources such as the door lock. Microsegmentation needs to be done with a software-defined approach. It is possible to implement microsegmentation with plain access control lists or ACLs, but it would be a very poor choice because of the administration cost and the difficulty of adapting to changes which are typical of mobile or work 2.0 environments. So, because neither the users nor the IoT devices are static, they move, they connect, and they disconnect, the policies cannot be tied to a location or to a port. In fact, it is the combination of multiple factors. It starts with the identity of the user or device, but not only that, it also varies with the time of the day, the location, and the device, etc. It's the combination of these factors what determines the profile, and the profile determines the service or segment. The policies included in the profile, which include both security and QoS policies, is what determines the microsegment. On Omni Switch and Omni Access Stella platforms, we refer to this as the user network or access role profile. In short, it has to be software or policy driven and not statically defined because that would be unmanageable. What is the end goal, the destination? It's simple, it's not new. It's authenticating every connection. It's assigning permissions which are required for the user or device role, but not more. It's segmentation to prevent threat propagation through lateral movement. And it's continuous monitoring and quarantine of any user or device that becomes non-compliant. This is nothing new, in fact. I could probably show you some slides from 10 or more years ago that would talk about the same concepts. Then, why is it that still today many enterprises are not there yet? The thing is, in a greenfield situation, it would be possible to build a zero-trust architecture using microsegmentation from the ground up. But in a brownfield, retrofitting the network with microsegmentation can result in those users, devices, and applications being offline due to failed authentications or incomplete policies. The question then is, can we go from the current status to a microsegmentation architecture without creating chaos as we do that? In practice, this is not easy to do when the network is already in place. But what is the situation in many enterprises today? At the access layer, it's inconsistent policies. Authentication on the wireless LAN, but not on the LAN. Segmentation which is done statically and tied to a port, a VLAN or a subnet and therefore cannot be changed without reconfiguring firewall policies. Users or devices on the inside are implicitly trusted when they're on-prem. IoT is a big compliance blind spot, and IoT devices tend to be the weakest and most vulnerable because they're not managed by IT. No compliance with password and many other IT policies, outdated firmware, no endpoint protection in the form of antivirus, etc. In many cases, these devices are not even known to the IT department. Many of these devices are very poor when it comes to security capabilities. Other devices may use major operating systems with strong security capabilities, but that doesn't mean that those capabilities will be enabled or configured properly. In some cases, a simple software upgrade may void the vendor certification or warranty. IoT devices represent the biggest and often overlooked security risk today. In the backbone, segmentation may be rigid. It is probably based on VLANs and VRF, and attempts to resegment the network require multiple touch points, changes in routing, etc. There's implicit trust also in the backbone because just like the user ports are not authenticated, uplink ports are not authenticated or encrypted either. This leaves the network vulnerable to man-in-the-middle, sniffing, and other attacks. With this picture in mind, migrating an existing network to a zero-trust architecture will likely require at least a partial redesign. It is difficult or even unlikely that an enterprise will be able to migrate in one go, in a single refresh cycle. There will be a period of time during which non-zero trust and zero trust will coexist, and migration will happen one layer or one location at a time. But the enterprise needs to make sure that the infrastructure elements that they deploy and the way in which they're deployed are flexible and capable of operating in a zero trust or micro-segmented mode when other infrastructure elements are ready. And this means that this infrastructure will need to interoperate with existing and future components. And here's those 5 phases that we've been talking about. Let's describe them one by one. First, and before doing anything else, let's start monitoring and building a map and inventory of what we have. Phase 1 is to monitor. Migrating to a zero trust architecture requires detailed knowledge of its assets, physical and virtual, subjects, including user privileges, and business processes. Incomplete knowledge will most often lead to failure where access is denied due to insufficient information. This is especially an issue if there are unknown shadow IT or shadow IoT within the organization. First things first, we start monitoring devices and traffic flows. What we need is an inventory report. There are specific tools that help with this and that you will see shortly. You may notice that this process is iterative. The first time we enable monitoring, the report may not be as meaningful as we would have wished for, but it's a start. As we make progress with other phases, they will become more specific and useful. The information that we gather in this phase will be key for the next phases. Phase 2, validate and assess, or assess and validate. The next step is to validate these findings. Assess the business need. Any shadow IoT that cannot be justified should be eliminated as it unnecessarily increases the attack surface. For the rest, we need to identify the subjects, the users, the traffic flows, and the workflows because this will be reflected in policies. Who will have access to these assets and what they will be allowed to do with those assets. Again, it's the principle of least privilege. Micro-segmentation does not mean relaxing other security policies such as password policies, firmware updates, etc. Individual capabilities should be evaluated. Can these devices support certificate-based authentication? Is there a management tool that will allow for those certificates to be issued and applied? What are the required traffic flows? We may need to get this information from the manufacturer, but we should also contrast it with our own traffic analysis report. If we find assets that do not comply with company policy, then we need a remediation plan to bring them to compliance, or we will need to put additional controls in place. Phase 3 is plan. At this stage, we already know the assets, the subjects, the traffic, and the workflows. We need to turn that into authentication and security policies to implement the required micro-segmentation architecture. Best results include a combination of macro and micro segmentation, but in most brownfield scenarios, we will be constrained by the architecture which is already in place. For macro segmentation, there's multiple options such as VLANs, VRFs, SPV VPNs, VXLANs or GRE tunnels, and special features such as private VLAN. Each of these have their pros and cons and can be useful in different situations. This will be a topic for an upcoming blog. In the micro-segmentation part, we need to know what policies to include in the profile for each user or device type. Lastly, we need to define how we will map users and devices to their segment and policies. This comes down to authentication or classification, which includes fingerprinting. Phase 4 is simulate. No matter how much we plan, it's unlikely that we will get it right the first time. Any error in the design of the authentication scheme, any omission that we make in the security policy allow list will result in a broken business process. What we do in the simulate phase is to apply authentication and policies, but in a fail open mode. What this means is that devices that fail to authenticate will still be allowed on the network, and unexpected traffic flows will still be allowed. But all of these will be logged, and with these logs, we can refine those authentication and policy schemes later on. Phase 5 is to enforce. After some fine-tuning, we will not observe any authentication failures or legitimate flows which are denied. We can then move those policies from fail open to fail close, which means that rogue devices will be blocked and unexpected flows will be dropped. Lastly, we continue monitoring for any unexpected devices and traffic flows. Let's now go through some of the tools and tips that will help make this transition. As mentioned before, one of the key requirements is identifying devices, and this includes all devices, whether they are sanctioned or not, owned or not. We cannot simply pull information from a CMDB. This information will most likely be incomplete. It's a case of you don't know what you don't know. We need to monitor it live from the network. We need to quickly identify and categorize devices which connect to enterprise-owned infrastructure. The device inventory is the key tool for this phase. As the name implies, it provides an inventory with all devices seen on the network and categorizes these devices by type, manufacturer, model, operating system, etc. This is information which is passively gathered and from things such as MacOUI, DHCP signature, and HTTP user agent. There's 30,000 plus different devices which are recognized. It will show you where, what switch port or SSID the device was last seen. It produces PDF and CSV reports that we can massage with Excel. You will use these for the next phase. You may want to add extra columns such as who owns the device, whether it supports certificates or not, what other resources or protocols it requires, etc. To sum up, having this information about IT assets that may not even be known or owned by IT is essential, because otherwise we will fail to take them into account when designing the micro-segmentation plan, and they will stop working. At this point, we will probably know about these devices and their owner because someone will start complaining. The other piece of information which is required for creating policies during the plan phase is traffic flows. Depending on the equipment that you have, you may obtain this information from flow monitoring tools such as SFlow or NetFlow, or deep packet inspection, which is what we see in this chart. We support deep packet inspection on advanced Omni switch and Omni Access Stellar access points. If we haven't configured IoT fingerprinting prior to enabling traffic analysis, we will see a report such as this one. Application or flow data will be lumped, and it will not be easy to tell which type of device is using what type of protocols. If you're using a different monitoring tool such as SolarWinds, etc., you may have to do some filtering based on subnet, etc., to find what you want. But if you have configured IoT fingerprinting and enforcement, which I will explain in an upcoming blog how you should do it, then you will be able to generate a report such as this one. This report, you can break it down by device type. You select the device type or role that you're interested in, and it will show you the statistics for that device type, essentially what you need to create a set of policies for it. In this example, we see that for a medical imaging device, there's 3 applications in use: NTP, RDT, and RTSP. And therefore, those are the flows that we will need to include in the policy for this device type. I will provide this and other tips in an upcoming blog, so make sure you sign up to Spacewalkers to be alerted when that happens. That's www.spacewalkers.com. Going into the planning phase, one of the things that we will need to define is the authentication scheme. I want to highlight that what we aim for is authentication. IoT fingerprinting is not authentication. It's an initial step only. Zero Trust architecture requires authentication. Well, Zero Trust and common sense also. And remember that we will implement authentication policies in a fail-open, monitor and login mode before we move to a fail-close enforcement mode so we can debug and make sure we got them right. What I will show is how we can design this fail-open authentication scheme. By the way, this and everything that I'm covering in this webinar is the same whether we are talking about wired or wireless access. We design the authentication flow, which is the term used in Omni Vista, like this. In an ideal world, the device authenticates through 802.1x certificates. The radio server returns a profile, which dictates the segment and the policy rules that will apply to this device. In the first iteration of the process, the segment will be such that the subnet will be the same subnet that was in use before. And this is because a change of subnet would likely require a change of routing and firewall rules. That's something we can do as we move forward with other network changes. Authentication generates an authentication record, and this is information that can be shared with a firewall, typically using radius accounting. It may well happen that the device does not attempt to use 802.1x, so we attempt MAC authentication next. MAC authentication is not nearly as secure as 802.1x because it can be spoofed, but it is better than no authentication at all, so we can use it until we are ready to progress to 802.1x. The radio server also returns the profile, which determines the segment and rules, and this also creates an authentication and accounting record. If no profile is returned, we attempt fingerprinting, which we can also use to map to a profile, segment, and rules. This does not generate an authentication or accounting record, but does get registered in the IoT inventory database. Lastly, we have a default catch-all in case profiles are not returned or everything else fails. But in the early stages, we will still map the device to a profile, which will lead to the same segment and rules, and will log the device in the inventory database. The way we structure this flow is flexible, and we may want to tweak it as we make progress. For instance, we may want to eliminate the MAC authentication altogether at first and add it later on after we have the list of MAC addresses which we obtain from the inventory report. Of course, when we have refined it, we change the segment and rules associated to the default profile to be very restrictive rules, allowing access to a bastion host only, for example. Another thing to notice is that when we use authentication, we can share the device role with the firewall such that the firewall rules can be based on device role and not just subnet or IP address. With this, firewall policies can be much more fine-grained. The other benefit is that by making firewall policies depend on the role and not on the subnet or the IP address, we can use different subnets next time we do a network redesign. If, for instance, we want to start using different subnets for different device types. Bottom line is this will be an iterative process that we will need to tweak, tune, and refine as we become more mature in use of authentication and segmentation. Something similar happens with the policies that we include in the policy list associated to the devices or default role. In a zero trust architecture, this will be allowed lists, which used to be called whitelists. This means that we will explicitly allow everything that is required and deny anything else. Continuing with the example from the medical imaging device that I showed before, we will include the application flows that we gathered from the chart. We also add to this list some other flows which are considered baseline or essential for every role. In this example, ARP, DHCP, DNS, and NTP. and the final catch-all at the end. In the early stages, this will be an allow statement, so effectively the policy list will have no effect on traffic, but by logging the traffic that makes it to the last statement in the policy, we can identify traffic flows that we may have missed. We leave the policies running in this fail open mode for a sufficient amount of time to make sure we don't miss any rare events. Once we are satisfied that every required flow has been identified and explicitly included in the allow list, we can change the last statement from allow to deny. At this point, we have achieved micro-segmentation for this device type. I touched upon authentication versus classification, as is the case of IoT fingerprinting. When using authentication, 802.1x using certificates being the gold standard, but this is also applicable to Mapbased authentication, we can integrate with a firewall and share the user or device identity or role with it. This is particularly important for IoT devices because these devices are headless. They cannot authenticate using a captive portal. They have no screen, they have no keyboard, they don't have a user associated to them. The advantages of this integration are twofold. First, the firewall can apply fine-grained policies to those IoT devices based on what they are and not just an IP address or a subnet. Again, it's the principle of least privilege. And what we share is not just what they are, but that they have been successfully authenticated to the network also. Second, the firewall policies are now user or role based, and so they are no longer tied to a subnet or IP address. This enables future redesign or resegmentation of the network. By the way, I've written 2 application notes that explain how to perform this integration with Palo Alto and Fortinet firewalls. The same or similar mechanisms are applicable to other next-generation firewalls as well. You can find these application notes in Spacewalkers. There's another kind of integration which we can do and is part of the continuous monitoring, logging, and quarantine that I talked about before. In fact, there's a range of distributed denial of service attacks that can be identified directly by the switch itself. But an external IDS can also detect a broader range of attacks such as viruses or other anomalies. You may remember some years back, several video surveillance cameras were infected with the Mirai malware, and one day they launched a coordinated attack on global DNS servers that affected services such as Twitter, Spotify, or PayPal. In such scenario, if the switch may not detect the attack all by itself, a centralized IDS most certainly will. Once the attack is detected, the IDS informs Omni Vista the IP address or IP addresses of the affected devices. Omni Vista locates these devices in its database and pushes a rule to move them from the profile that they're currently in to a quarantine role. The quarantine role is a very restrictive role. Typically, it will only allow communication with the Bastion host such that the device can be remediated. In this example, password change, firmware update, and so on. Let's wrap up with some key takeaways. A zero trust architecture based on micro-segmentation rests on 3 pillars: authentication with 802.1x IP TLS as the gold standard, differentiated policies associated to the user or device role, which go back to the principle of least privilege, and continuous monitoring and quarantine. In mobile Work 2.0 environments, micro-segmentation must be software-based, meaning it must be dynamic and policy-based, not statically defined. This would be impracticable. Migrating to a zero-trust architecture through micro-segmentation is a process, a journey. It is unlikely for an enterprise of any significant size to be able to get there in a single refresh cycle. But in every refresh or redesign or continuous improvement cycle, we can get closer to that goal if we put the right infrastructure and design in place. With that, I would like to thank you for your attendance, and I'm ready to take your questions.
Great, Patricio. We have some questions on the question panel. Let me start first with this one. For the micro-segmentation, do we need an Active Directory, or does Omni Vista 2500, can that do the authentication?
Well, this depends on the type of user or device that we want to authenticate. So short answer is no, you can directly authenticate against the Omni Vista 2500 database, especially for things such as guest access. It would make sense to do that. For other users such as employees, if the organization is already using Active Directory, then it will make more sense to proxy that authentication to Active Directory. For IoT devices, well, this really depends on the type of IoT device. Some IoT devices come with management systems that generate certificates, so it would make sense to proxy that authentication to that management tool. So there's a range of options, but in short, yes, you can do it with OV2500 alone.
Okay. What does a fingerprint authentication, or how do you use it in a real world scenario? What does it mean?
Okay, so it's important to understand that fingerprinting is not authentication. Fingerprinting is classification. So what does it mean in a real world scenario? Well, fingerprinting, what it does is it looks at different patterns. For instance, the MAC OUI, so the first 3 bytes of a MAC address, will give you an indication of who is the device manufacturer. But on top of that, we can look at other things. For instance, the different options that are requested when the device issues a DHCP request. Something that we could also look at is the signature in the HTTP user agent. So with all these different sources of information, you can pretty accurately determine what kind of device we're talking about. You can go as precise as not only what type of device it is, but also who's the manufacturer and what specific model we're talking about. So in a practical example, the way you would use it is, well, imagine in a brownfield scenario, let's say you are promoted to the role of network manager and you inherit a network where there's no authentication, let's say no records, and you don't know really what you have on the network. So you can turn on fingerprinting to have this first idea of what you have. And then once you know what you have, you can create some profiles to enforce different policies based on that fingerprinting. So if you determine that you have cameras, door locks, what else? Thermostats and so on, you create different profiles with different policy rules for those different device types. And the way you map the device to the policy rule is through this fingerprint. This is an initial step. As you get more mature, you really want to turn this into authentication, which is more secure, ideally 802.1x.
Okay. How are dual stack clients handled, and can we disable IPv6, for instance, guests being able to reach each other?
Okay, so there's different features that can do this. So that's called client isolation. Say on the Wi-Fi, it's a checkbox. You can turn that checkbox on and you get client isolation. On the wireless LAN, you can do things such as private VLAN. So private VLAN would give you isolation between different clients. There's port mapping as well. There's a range of features to do that, and this is something that I will be talking, in fact, in this blog that I'm planning.
Okay, a couple more great questions. Can you also do this micro-segmentation with servers instead of IoT devices, and how about PCs?
Yes, so the features work in the same way, but there's a few things that are different. So say if we are talking about PCs, particularly corporate issued PCs, perhaps it makes more sense to use the Windows firewall on those PCs, and the Windows firewall can be centrally managed. If we're talking about servers, it would make sense to use micro-segmentation. And when I say micro-segmentation, I mean the policies attached to the profile when those servers are bare metal servers. Because if we are talking about virtualized servers, there's a lot of traffic that happens inside the hypervisor. Say VM to VM communication stays within the hypervisor. It never touches the physical network. So the right place to do micro-segmentation in a virtualized environment would be either in the hypervisor or directly with a host firewall on the guest OS.
Okay. You mentioned shortest path bridging for segmentation. If I understood you correctly, what would be the advantage of using it?
Okay, so there will be a few advantages when using shortest path bridging for micro-segmentation. One advantage would be that with shortest path bridging, any policy change, any configuration really is done at the edge of the network. So say if you need to add another segment for another device type, then that only requires changes at the edge. You don't need to touch your distribution layer, you don't need to touch your core layer, etc. It's much simpler for that reason. And there's a few other reasons why SPB has some security benefits. The second one is that the core nodes on a shortest path bridging network don't require IP addresses. So for that reason, they cannot be attacked using IP-based attacks. So there's all kinds of different attacks that can be done using IP packets, but that would never affect SPB nodes, which are core nodes, because they simply don't have an IP address. They do have one for management, but that's completely isolated from user traffic.
Okay.
And then the third reason is that the services in SPB are also dynamic. So the service is only instantiated once a user successfully authenticates. If there's no user connected to that service, not only the service is not connected, the service is not even active. So you cannot do a denial of service on a service that's not even connected.
Okay. Okay. Is the fail open to fail close process manual today? And if so, are there any plans to use ML or AI to automate this process?
So the transition from making the fail open to the fail closed is a manual transition. Once you see that it's not automatic. So once you see that you no longer have packets which are being which hit the last policy in your policy list, or that you don't have devices that have to go to the default clause in the authentication flow, then you manually decide to make that transition from fail open to fail closed.
Okay. Let me just ask one more question and then we'll wrap it up. I don't see how this micro-segmentation would have avoided some of the recent ransomware attacks. Can you explain?
Okay, well, this really depends on the type of attack. Different attacks are different. Remember that what I talked about in the presentation is not micro-segmentation alone, it's macro and micro-segmentation. So it's a combination of the two. The rules that you apply in the firewall plus the rules applied on the switch or on the access point. It really depends on the attack. So some attacks would rely on someone downloading a zip file from an attachment or clicking on a URL. That would typically have to be filtered by the firewall. But there's other kinds of attacks that rely on lateral movement or peer-to-peer communication that they use the SMB protocol, for instance. A firewall would not be able to stop that, but micro-segmentation with NAC policies would.
Okay.
So it depends.
Okay. Are there any other questions on the line that anyone would like to ask of Patricio while we have him? If not, Thank you very much for everyone who attended. We really appreciate you being here. And thank you, Patricio, for a thorough presentation. You're getting lots of compliments on the comment screen that I'm not reading aloud to you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
You don't need to inflate your ego. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, thank you very, very much, everybody. And when the webinar ends, you'll get an email, of course, from GoToWebinar that will have the recording embedded within it. And there should be a short survey, which we would really appreciate any feedback you're willing to give us. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.